What's up, compadres, and welcome to another Bojinjin vlog. How you all doing? In this entry, I wanted to expand on what I've been talking about recently. So my last batch of entries has been along the lines of essentially how to kind of my main message in these videos is tapping into your sensitivity. That's one of my main teachings, right? And from that comes the kind of purpose of kind of giving you my all of my ideas and kind of insights and techniques towards living a life that is more aligned with your happiness, with your contributions to the world, and how we can all make the world a more loving, inspired, better place, right? More abundant place. And recently, I've been going about my own explorations surrounding kind of how to then implement a lot of these ideas into practice, right? I've in previous videos I've talked about things like allowing yourself, right, which is the gradual kind of rewiring, essentially, of your, first of all, lifestyle, and also kind of your internal circuitry in a way that will get you to start to focus more on joy, and it is ultimately, the goal is to get yourself to focus more on and to trust in the desires that come up in your body, right? Because a lot of times, as I've discussed in previous entries also, we live in a very abstract society, right? Or rather, our society is founded on very abstract virtues at times. And many of us, before we enter this awakening journey, are stuck with essentially a worldview and a set of beliefs and virtues and values that are basically like hand-me-downs in a way from like just the collective knowledge of the world. And thus, a lot of the times, we're taught to basically trust in the abstract kind of ideas that we've been handed, instead of the kind of inherent intelligence within us, right, which is in our feeling, in our sensitivity to energy, right? And so, the idea of allowing oneself is untraining ourselves from the conditioning that we've received of basically having a set of values that are unresourceful towards us finding happiness in life, right? Such as like believe, like kind of like having all of these abstract ideas about how we can live our lives more happily, but instead, it's a bit dark, I apologize for that, it's winter time, and kind of slowly redirecting that focus from an abstract one where, everything that we try and do in life is based on some abstract idea, like I need to lose weight, I need to get more learned, I need to read more books, I need to do this, I need to do that, and then I will find happiness, right? That's the idea, right? The abstract kind of sequence of logic is that if I do this, which is a piece of knowledge that's been, or advice that's been handed down to me from previous generations, or whatever it is, media, education, school, if I do this, then it will bring me happiness, right? And there's like 10 million different kind of pieces of information that we're bombarded with on a daily basis. And over a period of time, it's like we're slowly trained away from the very thing that is essential to our happiness, which is our feeling, right? Our desire, right? And there's a lot of negative connotation surrounding desire, right? And freedom, right? When I talk about freedom and sensitivity in the terms of like allowing yourself and like learning to trust in your desire, there is a lot of negative connotation towards that, right? It sounds good the way that I present it, because I'm giving it you in my own words, detached from like the kind of it, like the mainstream opinion kind of imposing itself in in the classroom, in a job setting, whatever it is, right? In the mainstream media. But, there is a lot of negative connotation around it, right? Desire is viewed as kind of immature, dangerous even. A lot of us who are on a spiritual journey or indeed a religious journey, there is a propensity within those kind of structures and communities to kind of birth this kind of very perverse idea that desire is the root of all evil, right? And looking at desire from a certain perspective, that is true, right? In a way, our pain is because we have desire, right? The reason we suffer is because we have desire, and those desires aren't met. Well, that's even the next step. But like the linkage that is very tempting to make in those circles is desire is the root of all evil because it leads to suffering, right? But actually, suffering is kind of more complex than that, right? And that is ultimately my exploration in these videos and in my own life. Trying to unravel, the kind of energetic nuances, you could say, that and ultimately, well, first and foremost, kind of trying to work out how to live my own life in accordance with my highest good and expression, and also learning to kind of using the ideas to formulate a communication that I can then give to anyone watching these videos, so that you can then take that and then use the tools and the ideas to then go and forge your own life, right? That is in alignment with your highest good and that kind of thing, right? And so, in this entry, I want to talk about the idea of allowing, right? So, I urge you to watch that video to kind of get, the initial picture of what I mean by it. But if you're someone who is, familiar with, personal development, self-help, spirituality, that kind of thing, then you probably have heard this term before, right? For anyone who doesn't understand, again, I urge you to watch that video a few entries back. But essentially, in a nutshell, allowing yourself is ultimately what I've been describing, which is basically trusting in that which flows through you, right? And even that's kind of, it's not like very concrete what I just described, but, for example, if you want to eat a donut, and this is like, if you watch my video, this is like, for some reason, this is my example of choice, but if you want to eat a donut, right, and you're the kind of person who is very hard on themselves in terms of you either you're someone who is really kind of vigilant in a way of kind of preventing yourself from indulging in things that you would deem as self-destructive, or indeed the second type of person who basically tries to do that but then fails and then basically beats himself into a pulp because of that, right? And both of these are examples of resistance, right? Which is the opposite of allowing. And really, the concept of allowing and resistance isn't very complicated, but it's an energetic thing, right? An emotional thing. It's to do with feeling. So if you're someone who isn't very in touch with their feelings, then perhaps you might need more concrete examples to illustrate. But ultimately, yeah, it's essentially kind of whatever thing you want to do, or whatever signal you're receiving from your body, from your feeling, it is to take that and basically amplify the signal of it, right, and to go in the direction of it, right? Because the inherent fear that causes us to be in a state of resistance against our desires, for example, is if I do this, then I'm going to sabotage myself. If I do this, people are going to view me in a certain way. People are going to lose respect for me. People are going to view me as a weirdo. People are going to think I'm fucked in the head. Or maybe it's some kind of higher abstract moral reason, I'm this person. I'm not going to even though I'm upset, I'm gonna pretend that I'm okay. And again, I made a video about this, like, being okay with not okay. I urge you to watch it as well. Um, I'm going to, even though I'm upset and angry or whatever it is, I'm going to pretend that I'm not, because I am a nice person, because I am a morally just person, because I'm the type of person who has integrity, right? And even though those rationalizations might sound they're actually very, very self-damaging, right? And this is the kind of crux of what I'm trying to teach in these latest videos, which is that yes, there is a higher perspective, right? A lot of the times, like, we do things because we believe there is a higher reason for doing them, right? And a lot of the times those reasons are legitimate. But the problem arises when basically that becomes too aggressive, right? When we start to forsake our well-being emotionally for those very high moral rationalizations, that is when we run into a problem, right? And so this is what I'm trying to teach with allowing, right? But then again, how do we slowly transition into a life of allowing? Because initially it's going to be very scary, right? If you're someone who is very hard on themselves, like I said, or like has very kind of strict moral kind of codes or like rules that they live by, then this is going to be very scary for you, right? But in a way, this is what, if you're like that, this is the thing that you need the most in order to kind of start to move in the direction of your happiness, right? Yeah. So maybe I'll go using my lamp. Sorry. An impromptu light source. Yeah. So basically, how do we start to then transition into allowing, right? Well, a lot of us on the spiritual journey, particularly those of us who kind of like were more people who did it their own way, like myself, who like didn't necessarily have like a very central kind of repository of like teachings and things like that to draw from. I had to do a lot of this by trial and error, right, and my own experience. But a lot of us, this might be familiar, like, we start off with this very kind of high, again, it dresses up itself as like, spiritual and enlightened, because, it is to some degree attached to our kind of, our will, you could say. It is somehow attached to, our feeling, in a way. That is what brought me onto this journey, like the desire to be free, right? Desire to be myself authentically. But we start off with this very, again, it dresses itself up as this abstract, as this, this very kind of divine spiritual thing. But initially it's overly aggressive still, right? And what we try and do is, we try to force ourselves to attain a standard of behavior, of living, that is, again, it is attached to this high, abstract idea of how we should be, right? Except it's in the form of like, oh, the nature of the universe is this way, and thus, I must align myself to that, right? But and if we do this, and again, if this is the case for you, then it's not necessarily wrong, right? But rather, it is what will happen is you will start to bump into walls, right? Which is, again, something I talked about in my previous few entries, in my introductions. I started to hit into walls where I was like, well, I'm still kind of miserable. Like, like there are times when I'm still angry, even though I know better. Again, even though I know better, I still find myself getting angry, and all of that stuff, right? Even though I have all of these high-minded ideas and ideals and developed ideas and perspectives, like I still fall victim to like, anger and despair and depression and all of that stuff, all of that negative, all of that like really visceral, real, the kind of, sentiment and the kind of stuff like, yeah, I don't know, that you just want to kill yourself over almost. Like, obviously it doesn't go to that extent, but Sometimes it does, you know, but like, yeah, the kind of things that you go into a spiritual journey to get away from. You know, a lot of us who were pushed onto the spiritual journey or personal development journey did so because we were in a great deal of pain, because of like, you know, we were deeply unsatisfied with how we were as people, how the world was, you know, that kind of thing. And, and and so we bump into these walls, right? And basically we have like a string of failures. Like, so for example, you might have in your vision that you want to become, like, pulling a random example out of my ass, essentially, you want to be a vegetarian, right? So you set off very aggressively. You know, it might be backed by a lot of enthusiasm, by a lot of passion, but that's what you do, right? You start on a journey to become a vegetarian or a vegan or whatever it is, right? Or, you know, to change your diet. So you go at it very aggressively, but after, like, you know, a couple weeks, if that, like, it breaks down and you cheat, right? You kind of flop, and you're like, fuck, and you do the characteristic, like, beating yourself up. You know, that step is very crucial. We beat ourselves up, like, to a pulp, like, you know, fucking stupid, why can't I fucking do it, man? And then you go into the whole, oh, I have no willpower, you know, I'm such a useless person, you know, like, I'll never get to my goals, you know, I wish I was different, you know, and you go through that, right? So this step probably is very familiar, but and you do this, you continue to do this, like, over and over again, and eventually at some point you realize, like I have, that, like, there are just some things you can't do. Like, in a sense, you kind of give up. You know, you start off with, like, this very kind of aggressive drive towards doing it, but then eventually you kind of get worn down. And there's a very magical moment when you have a realization where, like, essentially, you kind of give up, right? And so, okay, and so basically, you learn to then get into, then you then start to kind of get deep into your feeling, right? Because initially it's very abstract, and, like, kind of detached from feeling, right? So yeah, so I'm actually going to do a second part to this, because, like, this intro was a bit longer than I expected, but this can kind of be an introduction to what I'm going to talk about in the next entry. But and so this kind of, I made a video called "Consulting Your Feelings," right? And that was kind of the point at which, you know, this kind of getting worn down by continually failing started to take it, you know, like a kind of observable effect in me. You know, I started to, like, really notice this, right? And I realized that, you know, well, you start to ask the question, essentially, you know, what's so bad about having, you know, a standard diet? You know, obviously, you know, there are quite a few reasons why the standard diet is bad. You know, if you eat, like, you know, high calorie, high fat, you know, processed foods, obviously, you know, there are like a million reasons why, like, there is not so good, right? But you start to then ask yourself, well, if like, I try so hard to change my diet and it's not working, you know, and I still think about this food, you know, and it tastes good when I eat it, is it really that bad, right? And you start to kind of have this internal dialogue with yourself, which is like magical, because then you bridge yourself into like, actually applying, like, actually kind of entering into allowance, right? And, you know, I discussed this in that video, "Console Your Feelings," where you start to kind of, you realize that, you know, your feeling isn't necessarily leading you astray, right? And then there are all of these other realizations that come from this. Like, for example, in the video that I made entitled "Humanity is a Pitfall Species," I talk about how this, you know, part of this part, because all of this is really like one kind of segment of like, you know, the self-actualization process, where you're hammering away in like with like your kind of like new like abstract paradigm, and then like basically it gets destroyed, and like something new comes out of it. But so you have this realization. And like you realize, you know, a lot of times you are fighting against yourself, right? That's the realization you have when you are trying to aggressively change your diet, right? You are fighting against yourself, because the one thing you realize in this segment of the process of your journey is that, you know, your desires behind the thing you were trying to change were real, right? This is the crux. The desire behind the addiction to bad food, to video games, to whatever it is, that desire is real. And all along you've been trying to destroy that part of yourself, which is real, which is genuine, right? And for me, that this kind of like, the way that I'm putting it came after like the kind of internal knowing that occurred, you know, the kind of feeling of, you know what, I'm tired of fighting against myself, essentially, right? And so like you start to kind of compromise, and you realize that, okay, well, I've been trying to too aggressively change a part of myself, and now I realize that the part I was trying to change is attached to some genuine need that is real and is to be loved within me, to be accepted. And so I need to kind of tone it down a bit, right? And that's when you start to bridge into allowing, right? You start to realize that perhaps like you can keep fighting yourself and keep getting worn down, and the same patterns will keep repeating itself again and again, right? It was a necessary step for me to keep fighting myself as I was building awareness, and you know, my own kind of independent thinking, so that I could become aware of that pattern, so that now I can then be in a better space to like live life. But now that I recognized it, it's time to change something in my life. You know, it's time to stop resisting. Even though, you know, again, you know, like I made a video about this, there are two perspectives. There is the perspective of, this is where I want to get to, and that's very powerful, right? You know, that is what starts us on this journey. It is this ideal that, you know, things are going to be different one day. You know, that is also real. You know, I'm not slating it, but then there is also another perspective, which is your human perspective, your feeling, your desire, you know, your bodily needs, right? And you know, over time you'll realize that this part also needs to be respected, right? So you need to respect these two things. And so what happens then is that these two, now being in your consciousness, start to mold and shape into the birth of your natural rhythm, right? Or rather, I should say, the return to your natural rhythm, right? Because life, with its, you know, going to school and going to work and like having all of these different like holidays and events and rituals and appointments and things like that, it basically takes you away from that which is that rhythm that is natural within you, right? And when you once you've gotten a hold of these two aspects of goal and healing, essentially, of like progression and healing, you start to find once again your own natural rhythm for doing things, right? You'll move forwards when you need to move forwards, right? You'll heal yourself when you need to heal yourself, right? And so ultimately, in summary, it is like the main kind of point that I was bringing in this video, even though it's, you know, from the bigger picture of it, it's one part of this kind of dynamic, is allowing yourself. It is allowing that human, needy, emotional part of you to find its relief, to find its satisfaction, to find its love, right? Whilst also moving towards whatever goal or like abstract kind of moral ideal that you're aiming for, right? And indeed, that might change, right? When I was going really aggressively at the abstract thing, you know, like, I want to do this for the world, you know, I want to be this person, like, I don't want to be this person anymore. Like, you know, that has somewhat toned down. You know, I realize my limitations in a way, like I'm continually realizing my limitations day by day, but that might change along with, you know, you discovering the other part of you, right? And this basically leads very nicely into a journey where you start to find more and more your natural rhythm for doing things, and that is a very important part of you living a life of happiness. It is finding that natural rhythm, that natural flow that is inherent within you, but you've just been led out of, like, through like a life that is essentially like in crisis itself, right? Society is in crisis itself. It needs you, someone who is brave enough to venture on this quest, to find your natural rhythm, to tap into your sensitivity, to follow your joy, to go in the path of in the direction of your darkness, your shadow, and to understand, accept, and integrate it, right? To try lots of different things in life, to try different structures, to try different ideas, to try different things in relation to how they make you feel, right? It takes an explorer. And the world needs explorers to guide them. Society needs these explorers to guide it, because it in itself is in crisis, right? And so, yeah, this leads nicely into what I'm about to talk about. So I will see you in the second part of this, where I discuss essentially the practical step that kind of follows. Okay, well, I want to go in the direction of allowing myself, right? But then how do I get started, right? Aside from I try to do the things I enjoy, but still I'm unhappy, and whatever it is, right? And I'll talk about that in the next stream. So cool. Hope that was helpful, and I'll see you in the second part. Hope you're good. Peace out.